When the goldfish was asked, "How's the water?" it responded, "What's water?" Like the goldfish, our lived reality might be so all-consuming that we too fail to step back and truly comprehend it. In the social sciences, this stepping back and questioning of known reality is central to a scientific method called critical inquiry. In this process, we can learn something about the origin of our known social and economic paradigm and potentially open a door to an entirely new way of seeing things. In this video, we will employ critical inquiry to help better understand perhaps the greatest problem of our time, our current sustainability crisis. Could it be that this crisis is related to our inability to step back from our fixed or known social and economic reality in which this crisis has emerged? The context for this ecological crisis is most significantly market capitalism. To keep this profit-reliant system afloat, we have a global economy that does its best to achieve 3% growth every year, so a system doubling in size every 24 years. This doubling of growth has equated to ever-increasing resource extraction, pollution, and many other ecological problems. In response to these problems, there is now the widespread belief that renewable technology will allow us to continue with growth and make it sustainable, an idea known as green growth. Having established this growth context and the attempt to green it, let's now take a critical look at this system to see what new doors of understanding might open. Limits to Growth is a body of research offering a powerful critique of growth and the attempt to green it. This scholarship demonstrates that decades of growth have corresponded with many ecological impacts, such as increases in carbon, loss of biodiversity, plastic waste, and soil, water, and air toxicity. In terms of green growth, a central point in this analysis is that because this global economy is continuously growing, this increase in ecological impact has occurred despite the increasing uptake of renewables. Even though wind and solar generated more than 10% of global electricity supply in 2021, because of growth of the entire economic system, power from coal also rose 9% in the same year to a new record high. In the context of growth, this literature also points to a problem with renewables themselves, pointing out that while wind and sunlight certainly are green, harnessing and distributing this energy to meet our growth-fixated energy needs is not. For example, just the 2,000 wind turbines that the US wants to install by 2030 would require the mining of over 100,000 tonnes of copper, plus millions of tonnes of steel, aluminium, fiberglass, cobalt, rare earth metals, and other materials such as concrete. So, what then will be the ecological impact of even bigger green growth goals, like a transition of the world's 1.5 billion cars to electric? Can already seriously degraded ecosystems cope with the huge resource extraction now needed to manufacture and power these cars using renewables, let alone the 3 billion cars predicted by 2050? What about the roads and the urban sprawl? None of this is to mention the energy needs of other growth sectors, such as computing and electronics, retail, manufacturing, and tourism. All these industries must ceaselessly find consumer markets to meet their profit growth objectives. This necessitates wasteful resource use, such as we see in planned obsolescence. We must also remember Not only are rich countries committed to more growth, but big developing countries like China and India are also now reliant on growth too. If we take the lesson from the goldfish anecdote and stand back from our known economic paradigm, might we see that green technology could certainly be part of a more sustainable future, but that it might not be able to support the reality we have become so accustomed to, perpetual growth on a finite planet. Limits to Growth Scholarship sees the need for the over-consuming regions of the world to not only stop growing, but to also initiate a process of planned contraction of our resource demands. This is a process known as degrowth. So exactly where is degrowth supposedly needed? According to Oxfam, the top 10% of global wealth holders are producing a staggering 52% of global carbon. This is a good indicator of this group's general resource use, and so they are an obvious focal point for degrowth. But just who are these top 10%? You may be surprised to learn that it is anyone with a net wealth of US $109,000 or more. This would include many of us in the developed world. Indeed, many of us qualify to be in the top 1% of global wealth holders, needing only 1 million US net wealth to qualify. So, just how much degrowth is required of this top 10%? The UN's Emissions Gap Report gives us an idea, calling on those of us in the top 10% of global wealth holders to reduce our carbon footprint from where it is now at around 20 tonnes per person per year to around 2 tonnes by 2030. Along with the transition to renewables, the UN says this drastic reduction in developed world wealth is crucial for keeping temperature increases under 1.5 degrees and to create the right foundations for global resource justice. However necessary this resource contraction or degrowth of the top 10% might be, reducing developed world wealth like this seems highly improbable in our current social and economic reality. Let's now take the next step in our critical inquiry to try to understand why this is. While the need for degrowth is clearly urgent, to achieve it, we first need to face a major hurdle. Currently, we simply must continue to grow our economy to avoid the many social problems that stem from economic decline, such as unemployment. How can any government or any one of us embrace degrowth and opt for a simpler lifestyle when we need the jobs that depend on this consumerism just to put a roof over our heads? For instance, COVID's huge impact on the tourist industry had the positive effect of reducing some of the most unnecessary consumer carbon emissions associated with the huge amount of carbon produced during air travel. But it also put thousands of people reliant on tourism out of work, exposing them to serious economic and social problems. In the face of this immediate economic survival imperative, our longer-term ecological survival imperative is all too often set aside by governments and by many of us individually. This tension between economic and ecological survival has created a sort of politics of paralysis, where our reliance on jobs and growth is in serious tension with the planet's limits to growth. To get to the heart of this unworkable tension, we must deepen our critical inquiry to trace our reliance on this growth market paradigm back to its origins. What we find when we do this may be a surprise to many. It is capitalism's very first privatisation, the privatisation of land. While there are examples of feudal land domination and ownership as far back as antiquity, market capitalism's very first privatisation largely began with 16th century European land enclosures. Spreading through colonisation, people the world over were forced out of the oldest form of human settlement, local collaboration on land commons, and onto private land. The key point here is that when something we all need for survival, land, becomes private, we then have no choice but to sell our labour to the market so that we might buy or rent it back to secure housing and food. This land foundation has huge implications for most of us, affecting what we do for work, how much we work, our need for a car, as well as a host of other lifestyle decisions. This often means that many attempts at dropping out of consumerism first involve a whole lot of dropping in to secure this massive, often lifelong cost. So, land privatisation sits at the proverbial base of the iceberg. It is what most fundamentally makes us reliant on economic growth for the jobs to buy or rent housing. We have now reached limits to this economic growth, in that it's causing ecological breakdown. We might conclude from this analysis that for the reasons of sustainability and social justice, that a different type of land and housing opportunity is needed. Given this reality, what might an alternative look like? There are many conceptions of land relationship, which means we don't necessarily have to choose between capitalism's land privatisation and some sort of state socialism. For instance, might we learn something from our collective Indigenous heritage of local collaboration on land commons as an option alongside private land and the need for market opportunity? Central to this alternative is the recognition that land need not always be seen as a market good, but as with air and water, it can also be seen as a social or common good provided by nature and needed by all. As unlikely as restoring local collaboration on common land might sound, something very close to it already exists. This example is tenant self-help in public housing. Secure access to public land has empowered some public residents to participate in programs such as community food gardens, resource repair and resource share programs, housing management, maintenance, and in the UK, even housing construction. In so much as these residents are locally collaborating on common land, increasingly developing self-help skills to meet their own needs, they are practicing perhaps the oldest pre-market way of living. In a world where many people are unable to achieve security through the market, tens of millions in the global north and billions of people in the global south, where they are falling victim to unemployment, technological job redundancy, globalization of labour, homelessness, and increasingly, there's a growing group who are likely to find themselves without market opportunity because of ecological limits to market growth. For many of these people, commons housing and productive collaboration could represent a significant new opportunity in material security. Where welfare and now a universal basic income are proposed to help secure basic human needs, might self-help on commons mean people need a much smaller income and therefore become much less market reliant and more sustainable? Could such an option also be preferable for the leaders and wealthy in society who push for alternatives to the increasing cost of welfare and who also want to avoid the unrest that growing poverty inevitably creates? Could this option help balance the downsides and complement the many benefits of our market society? We have used critical inquiry to step back from our current growth paradigm and the attempt to green it with green growth we challenged these green growth assumptions with the insights provided by limits to growth and looked at the evidence for the urgent need for degrowth among the wealthiest 10%. This led us to investigate the politics of paralysis, why, despite present dangers, we're all dependent on even more market growth to survive. This took us on a deep dive into the foundations of our dependence on this market growth. The first, privatisation, land privatisation. Finally, we've looked at a possible way to provide an alternative to our reliance on unsustainable growth by restoring perhaps the oldest model of settlement, local collaboration on commons, but in a modern and urban context. With so many major problems on the horizon, could this oldest form of human connection to land and to each other help us balance our reliance on growth and help us respond to the many problems it's causing? Might many benefits come from combining the best of both markets and common systems, helping us achieve a future that could be better than anywhere we've been before?